goodness. Okay. Welcome to today's event, Islam in the New Egypt. My name is Samar Shahata, and I teach Middle East politics at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. And today's event is sponsored by the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, as well as the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today and to introduce the speakers. We're very fortunate to have both Dr. Jonathan Brown and Dr. Hiba Rauf Izzat with us today speaking about this topic, and I will be offering some brief comments at the end of the session. Dr. Brown received his BA from Georgetown University in history and his doctorate in Near Eastern languages and civilizations from the University of Chicago. He has studied and conducted research in Egypt, Syria, Turkey, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Indonesia, and Iran. He has many publications, including 3 books: The Canonization of al-Bukhari and Muslim, The Formation and Function of the Sunni Hadith Canon, Hadith, Muhammad's Legacy in the Medieval and Modern World, and Muhammad, a very short introduction published by Oxford University Press this year. He has published numerous articles in related fields, and he spent a significant amount of time this summer in Egypt working on a project about religious institutions in the New Egypt. We're also very fortunate to have Dr. Hiba Rauf Izzat with us today. She is a lecturer of political theory at Cairo University and a visiting lecturer at the American University in Cairo, and also a visiting senior fellow here at the Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. Anyone who has done work on contemporary Islamist political thought, Egyptian politics in the current period, must be very familiar with Dr. Hiba's work. She was previously a visiting researcher at the Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Westminster and at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies, and where we met last year at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. She has been very much involved over the last, I don't know how long, I should say, but for quite some time as a public intellectual in Egypt. Not only working at Cairo University, but writing in the popular press regularly on very important issues. She has been the academic coordinator at a number of different organizations, and she comes from us directly from Cairo only a few days ago. So without any further ado, I will let the speakers begin. Dr. Hiba will begin, followed by Dr. Jonathan. And then I will offer some reflections on what they have to say and on the state of Islam in the New Egypt afterwards. Thank you very much.
Okay. I prefer to stand so that everybody can see me. So it's a very strange setting for the room. Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you everybody for showing up, and thank you for coming. And I hope that we can have an interesting discussion and maybe some reflections together on a phenomena that is very interesting for many people now, which is the revolution in the Arab world. I will focus on Egypt, but I think that some of the remarks and observations might be also valid for other parts of the Arab world. If you want to talk about the role of religion in Egypt or religion in New Egypt, we better start by asking ourselves about the role of religion in Old Egypt, if there is an Old Egypt before the revolution, if we can say so, which is not very accurate because I don't think that Egypt has changed a lot due to the revolution. We are still in process of changing, so no radical transformation in functions and in roles has taken place, but it's in process and we can see and maybe we can anticipate some of the changes that will take place. I think that we can roughly, and I can be corrected if I missed anything in the comments, we can roughly map the religious in Egypt in 5 main sort of scenes or 5 main circles. The first circle is the religious institution, which is a bit strange for talking about an Islamic society, because we always talk about the fact that Muslims don't have a church and Muslims don't have a religious hierarchy and institution. But the fact was that the nation state or the modern state basically created such institutions and managed to control its finances and to control the way it is run and the leadership in these institutions and organizations in order to be able to deal with them. Something that we can talk about in another occasion when we talk about the modern state and religion in the Arab world. How it was interesting that the modern state brought along with it some modern changes in the relation between religion and state, and the historical genetic sort of components of the nation state of separation between church and state necessitated somehow that the new modern state would create a religious establishment in order to be able to pursue its negotiation or its division of power with it, which is interesting how imperialism and the changes that took place towards the modern nation state in the region brought along some changes that were very interesting. So first of all, the religious institution, the formal official one, and we're talking about Al-Azhar and the Ifta, the higher authority of religious opinion, or however you can translate it. We are also talking about the religion of people, the way people practice their religiosity. And this takes place in two forms. The normal sort of individual collective practice of religiosity that is not guided or monitored by anybody except the willingness of a specific person to adhere to a specific mazhab, school of jurisprudence, or to sort of follow a specific imam who can guide you. But at the end of the day, you are not part of any specific group or any specific organization. And this is the majority of Egyptians, that they practice the religion in their day-to-day life in a way that is more social, that is more related to their own decision. A second form is are the Sufi Orders, which is the practice of people of the same religiosity, but in a more semi-organized way by following specific Sufi orders. And we have some statistics that state that about 12 million Egyptians actually are somehow members or related to Sufi orders, which is not a small number. So this is a practice of religiosity that does take place outside the formal official institution. Yet the Sufi orders do have a higher council, so there is some sort of an organizational form of the different Sufi orders that is also witnessing all the time some conflicts and political sort of issues relating to the who runs the higher council of Sufi orders, the relation between the higher council of Sufi orders and the state, which was always a good relation. So in the time of late Mubarak, I'm happy to say that, late Mubarak. Okay. Late, not in the sense that he died, but previous president, as-Sabiq yani. During the presidential elections, the Sufi orders used to offer their bay'ah, which is a very interesting notion. They didn't say we support, they said nubay'a as-Sayyid al-Rais. The term is loaded with the religious notions, that we give oath to the president and we support the president. So there was somehow a semi-official nature of these Sufi orders, though they don't actually have the same status as the Al-Azhar and Dar al-Ifta. The third manifestation of the presence of religion in the public and political and social life was the movements. And movements, I mean by movements those who that did not manifest themselves in organizations. And I count here, and I will come to that in a minute, I count the Muslim Brothers as a party. Whether it was given a legal status by the state or kept being called al-Mahzura, the banned group, it is a political party. It's basically a political party in the way it is evolving around specific vision and ideology of Islamic nature. It has its own structure, it has its own hierarchy, so it's basically a political party, and it functions in a way or another like a political party. And by movements, I mean the al-Jama'at al-Islamiyya. I mean the different groups that are out of the sort of legal domain, and that all the time has been subject to different to sort of a tense relation with the state, starting from the, maybe you can say, starting from the Egyptian Revolution in '52. You know, we had at the beginning small groups emerging and fractions from the Muslim Brothers, and then the Takfiri voices started emerging, and then we had the Jama'ah al-Islamiyah and al-Jihad, and so these movements were there. There was all the time the tension and the stigmatization, but they have their followers, and even if the followers are not engaged in any violent acts, but there is that sort of mood in some areas, and we can spot that especially in Upper Egypt. So with the return, and we'll talk about that later, with the return of those groups to the scene, and with their attempt to sort of appear on the surface again, they are now establishing their political parties. So Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyah did not yet establish a party, but it announced that it had elections and the leadership changed, and now they have spokespersons. And you can spot, if you wish, some of their statements, public statements in the media every now and then, and they are coming back to act on the political scene. As for the Muslim Brothers, it's clear that the role in the pre-revolutionary era was very controversial. They participated in the democratic process since the 80s, yet they have been subject as a banned organization or a banned political party to different types of media campaigns to demonize them, and they have also, the members have also faced recurrently military courts, have been put in front of military courts and have been imprisoned for years. So they have been suffering, and they are part and parcel of the revolution, as we will see in a minute. The last but not least are the ideas about Islam, or what we can call the intellectual trends. We have individual voices that we can spot talking about Islam and its relation to society and the world. And we also have academic efforts that have been evolving around the notion of Islamization of knowledge and find their way in the academia to represent an Islamic civilizational voice, trying in different departments, in different universities, to talk about an Islamic perspective, a civilizational perspective of Islam, and how it can contribute to the different debates in social sciences. And out of that also came some voices that participated to the public debate on different occasions. So you have what we can call the intellectuals that speak in the name of Islam somehow, but they are not the institutionalized official ulama. They are Muslim voices in the public space. And this is also one of the parts of that map. What happened during the revolution? Many people, when they analyze the Egyptian revolution, they say, no, thanks God, it was not like the Iranian revolution. This is not an Islamic revolution. This is a youth revolution. This is a Facebook revolution. This is whatever we can call it. But it is not, because this nightmare of the Iranian revolution keeps coming back, and people confirm that this is not the same sort of as in the Iranian revolution. But actually one cannot overlook the very strong spiritual dimension of or component of the Egyptian revolution. For those who spent the 18 days on Tahrir Square, Jama'ah prayers, collective prayers, were held 5 times a day, even early in the morning, the Fajr prayer, for example. The slogans that were made were all the time loaded with religious notions and religious concepts. Okay, I can try to hold it. Okay. The passion for religion and the attempt to show that there were also Christians raising their crosses, even if fewer in number, for example, and the fact that on Jum'ah, during the Jum'ah prayer, Christians stood behind Muslims to protect them, and also a mass was held on different occasions on the square, So there was that sense that we are seeking the help of God somehow. So the religious factor cannot be overlooked in the spiritual dimension of religion, but it was very, very well carefully interwoven so that it would not become a factor of division. Neither between Muslims and Christians, nor between the more secularists and the more sort of observant members of the Tahrir Square community, a revolutionary community, or the state of Tahrir Square, and also the people who belong to religious groups. The presence of the Ikhwan was really obvious. And also we need to distinguish here between being a member of a religious organization and participating in your capacity as a citizen, which took place right from the 25th of January, and the stepping in of the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, and some Salafi groups later to sort of approve and give their full support to the revolution. Something that was called by the critics as hijacking the revolution. Look at them. They came and hijacked the revolution. The Muslim Brothers did not participate. Actually, there were hundreds and thousands of Muslim Brothers youth members who actually participated in their own capacity, and you can't really distinguish whether we can count that as a participation or not. It would be extremely unfair to try to classify, but it would also be unfair to ignore. So we have to be a bit sensitive about how we call this religious component of the scene of Tahrir. What happened? What was the main goal of Tahrir as we see it? It was not just bringing down the regime of Hosni Mubarak, but some people saw it as an attempt to re-establish the republic. So in a more sort of sophisticated way, some people call it establishing the Second Republic, but this use of the notion of republic disappeared very quickly. So we don't find it in the literature. At the beginning of the early days after Mubarak stepping down, people started talking about what we did was actually to foster the notions of a republic. The main energy that came against the regime came from the fact that people were resisting and standing against the fact that Gamal Mubarak would take over after his father, and we don't want to turn into a monarchy. So add to that a lot of socio-economic dimensions, political protest that has been going on in the country for decades, we can say, and that also manifested itself on streets since the 90s, the continuous strikes of the labor movement. Things were much complicated than just a Facebook campaign that turned into a revolution. This is too simplistic. So we are talking about a republic, and hence if we approach the scene as an attempt to re-establish or to stress on the notion that Egypt is a republic, we have to look into some dimensions that religion can contribute to in the future Egypt that are related very much to the notion of the republic as well. It's not only about now the Salafi movement is coming to the surface and forming parties, for example. So you see on the TV these Orthodox Salafis with the long beards, and you feel like, well, it seems a bit fundamentalist, and where are we heading to? Or, sorry. Or it's not about the Sheikh of Al-Azhar stepping into some of the debates and trying to bring different political groups together to write down what we call the document of Al-Azhar that stresses on the civil liberties of citizens, but yet also stresses that Sharia should be the reference for the constitutions and for the constitution and for the laws, for example. But there is a sort of mixture of attempts to explore what role can religion play in a coming re-establishment of the republic through which the political process is now going. We are trying to have our parliamentary elections, presidential elections that we hope would be fair enough to bring to the state, become a head of state, someone who for the first time does not come from the military establishment. What I see the role of religion in the coming Egypt or in the future Egypt is basically to provide some guidance for what we call public morality. And this debate is still at halt. We don't talk yet about that in Egypt. We're talking about the law and the constitution, and most of the fights have been going around that. And the second thing is to find a public philosophy for the Egyptian Republic. And the public philosophy means a vision for the future that people agree upon, and that is guided by the culture, not by the religion as in terms of faith, but in terms of what is the role of Egypt in its Arab, African, Islamic, and global context. And I think that some of these debates will not avoid touching upon some issues related to the role of Islam in the future Egypt. How did the different dimensions or the different actors or the different manifestations of religiosity change after the revolution? We have different indicators. First of all, the institutionalized, organized form of Islam in terms of Al-Azhar and Dar al-Ifta has been trying to stress that the independence of their entities, the heads are stressing, the independence of their entities is a must. So Sheikh Al-Azhar came early enough to state that Al-Azhar should become independent from the state, but he did not talk more about the role of awqaf in that. In order for Al-Azhar to be independent and to return independent, you need to free the endowments from the monopoly and control of the state. We have a ministry of awqaf, which is a contradiction in terms, because awqaf means that people endow and put money in order to serve public interest and serve public causes for welfare of society away from the state, so that it gives vigor and energy to the society and fosters its independence. And since the time actually of Muhammad Ali, not only the time of Abdel Nasser, the state has been trying to put its hand on that because it didn't want to. So the emergence of the modern state entailed as well a control of the society that took place and affected very much the role of religion in political and social life. So this is an issue that we have to look into. It's not enough for Al-Azhar to say that we want Al-Azhar to become independent and to practice its role in the enlightenment of the Egyptian and the Islamic mind and play its role as a circle of knowledge and religious education. But how you are going to do that and how the independence can be fostered in terms of independence of awqaf as well is not yet discussed. The way people practice their religion and their day-to-day religiosity did not change much. And it's very striking that I personally expected that during the month of Ramadan, less Egyptians would go to the holy sites for Umrah because of the economic circumstances, the ambiguity about the future, maybe the security issue, because we have a security vacuum, relative one, which is also amazing that the country is surviving basically without our police functioning. So far, there is no civil war, alhamdulillah, which is amazing, which amazes me every single day when I wake up in the morning and go to my work or walk on the street. You know, you might see some policemen around, but they are doing nothing. So it's a miracle, really. It's the hand of God, as I call it. So people practice their religiosity. I assume that this Ramadan we will witness less sort of interest in going to Umrah. At least you stay with your family. It's not safe to leave them alone. Massive hundreds of thousands of Egyptians went to Umrah as usual, religious business as usual in Ramadan, which also caused the problem with the Saudis because the massive number resulted in problems with the airplane traffic, and then the people had to stay in Jeddah airport for a couple of days, and they started sort of fighting with the Saudis, who also said to them, this is not a place where you practice your own revolution, and they started having verbal discussions, interesting discussions about the notion of revolution. So the practice of religiosity did not change, and during Ramadan everything went as usual. The late night prayers went as usual, so nothing changed in the sense of that people started taking the religion in a more political way. This did not happen. This is one of the things that are going as usual. Yet the other form of religiosity on the public level, which are the Sufi orders, changed their roles. We had an example that we had on the 29th of July. We had different demonstrations, and unfortunately, we reached a point when demonstrations on Tahrir started being organized by specific groups to prove that they can lobby. So, of course, the Islamists can lobby far more than any other group or party, but eventually some of the groups that called for demonstration on Tahrir Square managed to lobby at least 50, 60,000 people, which was fairly good. It reminded me about the demonstrations that we used to have since 2003, since the fall of Baghdad, and even before. If we reached the number of 500, we would celebrate. We ended up considering marrying our children to each other. You know, we knew each other. We knew the Marxists and the Nasserists and the Muslim Brothers and the independent ones. You know, and we became a family basically. Until now, we are very good friends because the number was very small. So that you bring to the square 40,000 people without the massive support of somebody or some organizations like the Ikhwan Muslimin was interesting, very interesting. It means people are on the street. But yet, it's not big enough to compete with a demonstration that was organized the 29th of July by the Islamic groups, and there was an attempt to bring in other parties so that it wouldn't turn into an Islamist demonstration. The attempt failed after some negotiations, and people went with the agreement to the square, but they couldn't control the Salafi sweeping presence on the square, and for those who followed might know the impact of that. It was understandable, actually. If you listen to the Salafi narratives, to the individuals who were on the square, even the most radicals who started saying, remember bin Laden and stuff that sounded very weird for the average Egyptian citizen, you would understand where those people came from. Those who had the black flags actually belonged to the Jama'ah Islamiyah and to the jihadists and to Al-Qaeda at a specific point, and they came back to Egypt. They couldn't believe themselves. They are on the square. They can say whatever they want and they can get away with it. So there was a euphoric sort of reaction, and you can understand if you listen to the narrative of people who have been imprisoned for 15 years, 18 years, detained actually without facing any charges, how sort of excited they were. But this was not healthy for the wider political scene, but explain it to an individual who has suffered so much. I know of gatherings, and specifically of a meeting of Salafi groups that took place 10 days later, and that started assessing what happened during that 29th of July demonstrations, and they admitted that it was intimidating to the public and to different groups, and they should revise it, and if anything of the sort happens again, we should try to organize it more, sort of in a more decent way, so that we do our own sort of self-expression, but don't intimidate other political groups. And I was happy about that there is that sense of self-criticism that is taking place. Those people are not stupid. Those people are coming back to the scene with a lot of inexperience to be in the light, you know, to be on the surface, not on the cover. And they are a bit maladroit. They don't know really what to do, and they listen when you talk to them, and they seek advice. We at Cairo University will organize more than an awareness campaign, and we had these courses, crash courses of 1 week for those who are coming into the political scene as citizens and want to know more. It was some sort of a public service of the faculty. And every time we announced an awareness sort of course for a week or so, what is the constitution, the formation of the political system in Egypt, blah, 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 50%, 60% would be Salafis, would be coming with their galabeya, with their long beards, it was a scene, but they were very keen to sit, and I participated in some of those lectures, giving usually a talk about women and citizenship, and they were listening, and they were writing notes, and they were arguing a bit, but with a sense of, we want a bit of clarification. Can you explain this further? We disagree on that, but cautiously. It's like there is a process of transforming those groups into publicly acknowledged groups, and they have a sense of citizenship. They are coming back. I had a personal fight with a nice colleague at the British Council. We were talking about the engagement of youth and organizing some. I was consulted on organizing some sort of programs for the youth by the British Council in the new era, and they were talking about youth. So I said, but mind you, which youth? I mean, are you going to engage some Salafi youth as well? And they said, Salafi? I said, yes, not only the very good English-speaking, middle-class, Westernly educated, sort of, how you call it, funky, cool, You have also to have a bit of long beards and who are youth as well, who are also might be 18, 20, 25, 26, So the lady there said to me, but these are fundamentalists. I said to her, no, mind you, these are citizens. If you don't like the way they look, you have to remember that they are citizens, and if you are going to organize something for youth, these are youth as well, and they are Egyptians as well, and it's about time that they take a part in whatever you are organizing. So this is new. This is a new scene, and engaging with many of them in different circles, including a forum that I joined for the Islamic groups and parties, to sort of a consultation forum. I find that there is something new that I'm witnessing at the moment. We have the political parties, talking about the Muslim Brothers. I think that the Muslim Brothers gained a lot during the revolution. Many of the youth on the square and of the political activists during the revolution said we didn't expect them to be so cooperative. We didn't expect them to be so accommodating of difference. And I think that they gained a lot of interest and a lot of respect during the revolution with their participation, especially when they were in the front rows, when there were sort of more violent confrontations with the thugs that used to come every now and then. Especially the peak was what we call the Black Wednesday, when there was a very violent confrontation. But at the same time, the problem is that the Muslim Brothers, from my own perspective, are acting like elephants, and elephants only see elephants. So it's a mindset. And coming from the underground in terms of the organization to become acknowledged as a political party, and also opening the Jama'at al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin as al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, as the Muslim Brothers. Their headquarters in Muqattam, they only had a small headquarters which was a flat in Manial area. Now they have a full building in Muqattam where they receive EU representatives and prime ministers, and actually till today there is no legal basis for such building, for such group. I mean, they started establishing Al-Hurriya wal-Adala, Freedom and Justice Party, but Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, as in the headquarters of Muqattam, have no legal basis. They are neither an NGO nor a foundation, nothing. And even if they establish the political party, we still need to know. So they will be struggling with their positioning themselves on the scene. But so far the problem is that I think that they have been acting with a mindset of a pre-revolutionary setting. So they have been on and off trying to sort of do some coalitions with old parties. We ended up with a big coalition with Al-Wafd and other few small parties. They have been in negotiation with the military council, and the way they deal with the youth that actually were more present on Tahrir Square in their name was exclusion. So they fired groups of youth that wanted to, after the revolution, to take their own decision in their own hand and have their own political calculations, and this resulted in a fraction. So we need to see how this would develop, and we hope that in the future they would come around with the idea that you have to be much more tolerant within the organization as well as outside. Related to ideas, I think that this is also one of the problems that we are facing. The intellectual voices of the Islamic background, I wouldn't call them Islamists, but I would call them Islamic voices in the public square, are still very sort of incapable of dealing with the new scene. There is no voice given to them because the media basically wants to have politicians or members of organizations and political movements in order to have this sort of confrontational debate type media coverage, and this does not really help build a consensus between the different groups, and it does not call upon such intellectuals to analyze, and many of them decided that they will keep out of the political party domain. They did not join any parties, but they are working on trying to understand and the scene. My concern with what is going on the scene is that many groups and many individuals as well, and many parties and many Islamic organizations went very much into the political scene. After the 29th, as I mentioned, with this Salafi presence, there was an attempt to organize another Friday on the square, and there was a statement published called In Love of Egypt to bring together the different groups. And this is not, it started by saying this is an anti-Salafi Friday. And then they said, no, we are not an anti-Salafi Friday. We are just a Friday for Egypt. We don't want this polarization. And the statement was signed by Coptic groups, by communists, by independent secularists, and by Sufis. They found that they cannot come up with a big number, and if it's about showing off with numbers, the Sufi might be able to provide that. And this was the most strange sort of statement that I read since the revolution, because there was nothing that would bring together such groups that signed the statement. Eventually there was a split and it didn't take place. That specific Friday, only the group of 6th of April managed to organize a small demonstration, and it ended up with a bit of clashes with the military and security forces on the square. So this is also a new emerging thing, that the Sufis might be joining hand in hand with other groups in order to face the Muslim Brothers and face the Salafis. What my concern is actually, and I have flagged it many times, is that many of the religious groups actually have serious and strong and very powerful social capital. What would happen if that social capital would turn into a political capital? There is a serious problem here, that once this political capital goes into the domain of conflict and contestation, it's very hard to go back and preserve the social capital that they had built. And entering the domain of politics might be actually harmful eventually for their own Islamic higher ideals, or the da'wah purpose that they have and hold as their main goal. This might be harmed by turning into political forces. But nobody could actually uphold themselves from doing that, as if politics in the party sense or politics in the power politics sense attracted everybody. I don't know what gets into the heads of people. I'm not feminist, but power gets into men's heads. So you find everybody forming a party. We have this joke that every 3 people who sit on a cafe and have a shisha, they decide to form a party. كل 3 بيشيشوا بيعملوا حزب النهارده في مصر. So this is, for me, this is very unfortunate, because if the different types of religious groups and religious movements go into the political, what would happen to the civil society and its civility that was very much enriched for long by the presence of Islamists and by the presence of Islamic different organizations that actually played a very important role in social solidarity, but also played a very important role in providing the civil domain with very positive ethical and moral sort of capital. What would happen in this case? This is my main concern. I will finish here, and I will stop just by 2 points. One thing is that I think that the religious groups and institutions and voices need badly to introduce figures that are independent from the political conflict and the political competition that is taking place. Because in the coming few months in Egypt, we badly need to negotiate with the military council. And so far, there has been no negotiation with the military council. There has been meetings. So the military council invites some intellectuals or receives some party members, and they talk. But there hasn't been a serious negotiation process taking place by some groups with the military council to talk about the future of Egypt. Only demands. And I think that this is not acceptable. And in the course of time, due to the nature of the society, somehow religious figures or religious voices have to come and become part of the mediation process between the political forces and the military. So far, this did not happen, and I think that this is one of the things that religion might play, the role of mediation, or religious groups or religious voices can play the role of mediation instead of becoming the counterpart of different other political groups. The second thing is that I think that the missing dimension is talking, as I mentioned, about the role of religion in public philosophy and in public morality and in the public debate at large, and this has not been subject to discussion itself. It has been taking place as a source of confrontation between religious voices and secular voices, but talking about the role of religion in the future Egypt has not been the subject, and the fights over the constitution do not reflect what I mean. What I mean is, what form of role do we expect of religion in the coming public debate in Egypt. And I think I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Now we turn to Professor Brown.
Thank you very much for coming, especially Dr. Hibba. Is this projecting as well as she was? Okay. No? I really have to hold this. That's okay. I guess I'll just hold it. So it's actually very intimidating for me to be here because Dr. Hibba has been my sheikha for, almost going on 10 years now. So I'll touch on a few things she spoke about just briefly. One, when we look at the different Islamist groups or Islamist strains in Egypt today, I think we can divide them into two separate strains as relates to politics and political involvement. First one is sort of a continuation of the mainstream leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood from before the revolution, which is that this is a party, a group, a movement that seeks to attain power, that seeks to somehow influence society in legislation, through social movements, through social services, and potentially through taking control of parliament or affecting parliament, and in a dream, taking control of the country's presidency and actually running the country. So that's the sort of old school vision of the sort of mainstream Muslim Brotherhood from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. We would also, I think you could put most of the Salafi groups in this camp, as well as, and what's a good example of a Salafi group? Not only the Fadila and the Noor groups, but also the Jama'ah al-Islamiyya group of al-Banat wa Tanmiyah, which is the group founded by the Jama'ah al-Islamiyya, most of whom were in prison until the early 2000s. And I would also stress that in this group you would find today the major members of the Guidance Council of the Muslim Brotherhood, people like Khairat al-Shata, people like Al-Samad al-Ariyan, and of course the Murshid, the guide, Muhammad al-Badi'i as well. So this is sort of a continuation of the idea. This unit, this group, whether it's the Salafi group, the Jama'ah al-Islamiyya, the Ikhwan, they're going to form political parties or apolitical parties or multiple political parties, and then they're going to move into the political realm. The other group, I think this has to do very closely with what Dr. Hibba was talking about, is this idea that there has to be a separation between party politics and religious movements. That the Muslim Brotherhood was always supposed to be, is, and should be a social movement that does things like religious education, that provides social services, that enlightens the population as a whole about Islam and tries to improve religiosity, and that is not a political function. If members of the Muslim Brotherhood want to get involved in politics, if they want to start a party, they are free to do so, but not in their capacity as Muslim Brothers. And this is, in fact, what led to the formation of the Wasat Party in, I think it was 1996, when people like Abu Ala al-Mahdi, who's the current head of the party, said, we're Muslim Brothers, but we want to separate between the political function, the political mission of our Islamist group and the social and religious mission. And we want to create a political party that will bring people together from all sorts of parts of society, all sorts of parts of the political spectrum, to try and pursue the Islamic mission of the Muslim Brotherhood in the political field. Other people who today would belong to this strain are one of the presidential candidates and former Muslim brother, Abdul Minim Abul Fatuh, who was sort of expelled from the Muslim Brotherhood in mid-June. And also, interestingly enough, elements of the Jama'ah al-Islamiyya leadership as well. People like Nagih Ibrahim, who's sort of one of their chief writers and ideologues, who's distinct, I think, has broken very much with the rest of the Jama'ah al-Islamiyya Brotherhood, which feels like they want to get, as a movement, into politics and has formed their Hizb al-Bana wa Tanmiyah, their building and development party, I guess you'd call it. Now, but I think it's also very important to remember, one, how this distinction actually plays out on the ground. I know you might think, well, it's sort of an academic distinction, but it actually means a lot, because there's a distinction between saying our current organization, let's say the Muslim Brotherhood, with its logistical features, with its organizational expertise, with its leadership structure, with the actual people in that leadership structure, we are going to, as a group, get involved in politics. We're going to do negotiations with the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. We're going to orchestrate political organization. And between saying that we are going to have to separate ourselves from this institutional structure in order to do that, and recreate another institutional structure in the political realm. So it seems like an ideological distinction, but I think it's also a very important practical and logistical distinction. And that's why it is really, I think, in my personal opinion, Dr. Hibben may disagree, an important dividing line between the two, what I would say, two groups of Islamists in Egypt today. But it's also very important to remember that none of these groups are calling for the sort of Islamic state that people here in Washington, D.C. tend to get terrified about. People like, Elena Ross Layton, who's the head of the Foreign Aid Committee, I think, in the House, who said that, the American aid to Egypt is partially, to a great extent, contingent upon how much the Muslim Brotherhood is involved in the Egyptian government. So basically, the more the Muslim Brotherhood is involved in the Egyptian government, the less money the Egyptian government is going to get. Which I think is an interesting take. Anyway, so I think it's very important that the dominant, almost I think exclusive discourse on Islamic State is the Wasat vision, the Wasatiyya vision, the idea of moderate, middle ground Islam, which is very much linked to Yusuf al-Qaradawi's thinking on this issue of Islamic State, which says that an Islamic State is dawlatun madaniyatun tahtakimu ila sharia al-Islamiyya, a civil state that seeks as a major source of legislation and law the Sharia. And it does things like follow the maqasid al-ulya of the Sharia, the highest aims of the Sharia, which are freedom, justice, protection of property. I mean, everybody agrees with this stuff. Nobody's going to say, I'm against freedom, I'm against protection of property, right? So this is a very moderate vision of an Islamic state. Now, if you look at the sort of extremely conservative, or the conservative / Islamist extreme of this thought, you have groups like the Jamaat al-Islamiyya. But even they are committed to, in writing and in speaking, this Wasatiyya vision of an Islamic state. Now, a lot of people can say, well, they're just saying this. If they get into power, then they'll do something else. I mean, I'm not into the business of predicting the future. I only go by what people say. I think that the structure of Egyptian society today, and the nature of Egyptian society today, is not going to allow for some theocracy. This is never going to happen. You're going to have a middle-of-the-road, moderate, Islamically influenced state. But, and even when you look at the Jamaat al-Islamiyya's rhetoric, and I remember I was at the press conference when they announced their party, and even the man who was one of their spokesmen, Osama, I forget what his last name was, he was saying, someone got up and asked, of course, the press immediately were getting up and asking all these questions. Are you going to make women wear hijab? Can a Christian become the president of the country? And they said, you know, we're not going to make women wear hijab, but we would, you know, we can advise people as religious individuals that we can advise them to do this. We won't make them. But one of the spokesmen said, well, listen, you have a country that's 85% Muslim. Why is it so inconceivable that they say the president has to be a Muslim? And he was very interested on how Denmark and England, the kings of Denmark, England, or the queens have to be, you know, Anglican or Danish church. So why is it that we can't make requirements about the religious identity of the president? But what I thought was very interesting is not the validity of his argument, but the fact that he's trying to justify Islamist, quote-unquote, Islamist positions through the language of democracy. And that this is now the language in which you have to make arguments if you're going to be accepted on the wider Egyptian political stage. Not just internationally, but I think also domestically. Finally, I think the real issue here is, are elections going to be free and fair? Not only parliamentary elections, but presidential elections eventually when they happen. Is the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces going to, either overt or covert, direct or indirect means, control these elections and choose some kind of leadership that is acceptable to them and ultimately to their backers, certain countries that will go unnamed, right? This is the big question, I think. And if there's any force, in my personal opinion, if there's any factor that can make these elections free and fair, it's going to be continued protests by the Egyptian people. Because that's really the only thing so far that has gotten the Supreme Council of Armed Forces and the interim government basically to back away from seizure of power, return to policies of the previous regime. And then the question is, if protests are the only thing that is going to work, are Islamist groups going to support those protests and participate in them? Or is one group from amongst these Islamist parties or organizations going to get into bed, quote unquote, with the SCAF and basically become the partner with the SCAF, where they become the acceptable leadership alternative that the SCAF will support in whatever parliamentary and presidential elections eventually occur? So I think that's really the big question. And ultimately, the debate in Egypt today about, is it a secular country? Is it a Islamic country? In a way, I think this is sort of red herring for the real question, which is whether or not Egyptians are really going to be able to choose their own leadership, the Egyptian population, or whether this is going to be something dictated by the armed forces.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Brown. I think in the interest of time, I'll speak just very briefly. I largely agree with everything that was said by the previous speakers, which shouldn't be surprising, noting who they are. I will say a couple things, and I come at this as someone from the discipline of politics and so on, so maybe my perspective is a little bit different. I would say, just to remind everyone, that although there's no question that the Muslim Brotherhood and especially youth elements of the Muslim Brotherhood played a significant role in the revolution between January 25 and February the 11th, revolution in quotation marks, it is worthwhile reminding everyone that the Muslim Brotherhood was not one of the organizing groups of the revolution and in fact of the January 25 protests. And in fact, the Muslim Brotherhood, as well as many of the established political parties, not all of them, were against the January 25 protests. They announced ahead of time that they would not participate. In fact, Isam al-Arian, now one of the heads of the Freedom and Justice Party, a member of the Shura Council, said that because the police in Egypt had played a historic role fighting British colonialism and so forth, we would honor the January 25 day and we would not participate in the protest. The left said the same thing and so on. That being said, it is true that Muslim Brotherhood youth elements were very active from the very beginning of the protests in Tahrir and in other cities throughout the country. And when the extent of the protests and demonstrations became evident in the following day, really, or 2 days, the Muslim Brotherhood, and then when it became clear that this would be a potentially historic turn of events, and when it also became clear that it became a life or death battle for the regime, and if the regime survived, the Muslim Brotherhood would be the primary victim of the regime's wrath. The Muslim Brotherhood then, early on, put its full weight behind the revolution. Not at all to minimize the participation of the Brotherhood, but just to remind everyone that the Brotherhood didn't plan the protests on January 25th, and that the Brotherhood is not a revolutionary force. And I think this is quite interesting. There is nothing in the philosophy of Hassan al-Banna or any of the major Brotherhood thinkers that adopts revolution as a philosophy. It is a reform movement, right? That's the first point. The second point is, I think, and what that means is, as a reform movement, the Brotherhood has been willing to accommodate itself to regimes in power in the past, to make deals with the regimes for its own interests, to carve out limited space of political activity and autonomy. They did, in the previous decades, come to agreements that were frequently broken by the regime, and it's quite likely that they could come to some agreements or tacit understandings with the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces which is really the obstacle, has become the obstacle to fulfilling this unfinished revolution and really moving Egypt along a transition to a fully democratic state. Okay, that's first. The second point, I think, is at a very general level, and to do great damage to the specificity and the complexity of the debates and the movements and so on, one can look at what has happened in Egypt from about mid-February, really a week or so after the revolution, in quotation marks, succeeded, until the present, as being largely a struggle over the symbolic character of the future state of Egypt and society. A struggle, a symbolic struggle between largely, and again I'm doing great injustice to the specificity of the situation, Islamist forces, not just the Muslim Brotherhood, but the mushrooming of Islamist forces in the society, and what we could call liberal and secular, I'm uncomfortable somewhat with the term, secular forces in Egypt. It is amazing to think that the major debates that have taken place in the country over the constitutional referendum, the amendments on March 19th, 2011, as well as on the elections and the sequencing of the political timeline, whether elections should come first or whether constitution writing should come first, have largely been played out through the lens of Egypt's, the status of the future state, being a civil state, a religious state understood in a particular way, and so on. What I'm trying to get at is that if we look at the debates that took place around the March 19th constitutional referendum that had nothing to do with Article 2 of the Egyptian constitution, right, that Islam is the religion of state and the principles of the Sharia are the basic sources of legislation, the debate about the referendum took place largely in a context of Islamist discourse about whether that constitutional amendment was somehow threatened or imperiled by a no vote to the constitutional referendum, when in fact the amendments that were being voted for had nothing to do with those issues, but had everything to do with the specifics of candidacy for the president, amending the length of term of the president, mandating a vice president. As you know, we haven't had one in Egypt since 1981, and these kinds of issues. But the debate was largely, if you vote yes, if you vote no for the constitutional, against the constitutional amendments, somehow you are voting against Article 2 of the Egyptian Revolution and somehow threatening the Islamic character of Egyptian society and the future, even civil state. Similarly, the debate about the sequencing of elections and constitution writing has largely been, not entirely, largely been a debate about the potential role and influence and position of Islamist groups, and particularly the Brotherhood, in the future Egyptian polity, with those groups that are making the argument, or that did make the argument in the past, that elections should be delayed, that they should not take place originally when they were scheduled in June, then when they were scheduled in September, and now that they're scheduled in November, and we'll see whether those elections actually transpire in November, that allowing elections to take place early would benefit those groups in society that are already organized, that have participated in elections before, and that therefore would undermine those groups that are most democratic and that participated in the revolution. Namely, the beneficiaries would be the Muslim Brotherhood and the remnants of the ruling party, and therefore it is in the interests of Egypt's democratization, as well as the new secular groups and the real revolutionaries, to have the elections pushed back. The debate about the political sequencing of elections and constitution writing has largely been that. Similarly, now that the referendum passed by 77% of the electorate on March 19th, and that the timeline has somewhat been established, although the SCAF has been renegotiating this, depending on how many people can one group muster to Tahrir Square and so on. The current debate is about the supra-constitutional principles, right? So now that the liberals, I'm not going to say secularists, have lost the referendum, and have lost the question of whether the Constitution is going to come before the elections and so on. Now they are trying to make their case to ensure the necessity of a civil state and to ensure the necessity of equality for all in that state, regardless of one's religion and so on. They are trying to put forward this idea of supraconstitutional principles that regardless of what happens in the future and what the Constitutional Committee that is elected writes in the constitutions, these principles, a kind of Bill of Rights, are inviolable, right? And of course, again, we're having resistance, understandably, from Islamist groups, particularly the Brotherhood and others, about the acceptability of this and whether this violates the democratic principles that were relating to the referendum that has already taken place. Just the last points, and not really comments, not really extended remarks, have to do with the fact that we do have to remember that the Brotherhood, not unlike its previous strategy under the Mubarak regime, has declared repeatedly, although this has changed, that in the upcoming parliamentary elections, they will limit their electoral participation. Initially, Mohammed Badia and leading members of the organization suggested that they would only run candidates for a third of the seats in parliament. Then that number increased to 50% of the seats in parliament. They also, for quite some time, have been saying, and this remains the case, and I doubt it's going to change, that they will not nominate a candidate in the first presidential elections, and in fact, that was the conflict behind Abdul Minim Abu Futuh's departure from the Brotherhood, because he announced his candidacy, and therefore he could not remain in the organization. The other point that I will make is really just to kind of emphasize something that Professor Brown mentioned, which is how American politicians and the American media unfortunately often view the situation in Egypt. And it really comes down to two issues, I think, really. Egypt is seen through the lens of Egyptian-Israeli relations and what's happening with regard to either the border, Gaza, Rafah, the embassy, and so on, and secondly, Islamists. And what this means is that we can expect, if not a deterioration of Egyptian-American relations, I wouldn't go that far, but certainly continuing tensions in the relationship in the future. We've seen, of course, what's happened with regard to the relationship with Israel, quite understandably, because the previous regime's position was completely out of touch with regard to Egyptian popular sentiment. And regardless of what happens in the upcoming elections, whether the Brotherhood wins 15% of the seats or 30% of the seats, that's going to be seen as threatening by many people in this city, particularly in Congress. And that could potentially have consequences for U.S. largesse to Egypt in the coming period. I will stop there.